out of a nonprofit organization in the Hill District, which was a somewhat neglected a organization by the name of Freedom House Enterprise, whose director was Jim McCoy. Started the nonprofit organization to provide job training for residents of the Hill, job placements, voter registration. There was also a little mini food bank inside this facility, which is located on Center Avenue in the Hill District, that delivered food to the residents of this underserved, neglected neighborhood. So it had a board of directors that had CEOs and things, so it was actually a corporation. And one of the board of directors of this corporation came up with the idea, his name was Phil Hallen, that if this organization can deliver food to the residents of the Hill District, why can't they deliver medical care? And the reason that's important is because the residents of the Hill, we had to rely on the police to take you to the emergency room. So if you could imagine a police wagon coming up to your front door and two officers, which were predominantly white males, placing you in the back on a canvas cot and transporting you to the emergency room. The problem with that is if something happened to you back there, you stopped breathing or your heart stopped beating or something, then there was nobody back there to help you.
Right.
So you oftentimes arrived at the emergency room worse off than when they picked you up. So Freedom House came up with the idea that said, okay, we don't want to rely on the police because our relationship with the police is somewhat adversarial.
Yeah.
And they came when they felt like it. If they didn't feel like it, they didn't come. If they wanted to transport you, they did. If not, they didn't. So Freedom House itself wanted to provide medical care to these residents of the Hill. So they didn't know how to get that done. So Phil Hallen knew the director of Presbyterian Hospital at the time, which is now UPMC, and he called him and said, I'm with this organization that has this idea on how they want to deliver medical care to the residents of the Hill. And the director, his name was Ed Norian, he said, okay, come up and let's meet. So the board of directors went up and met with him, and he said, well, I have the perfect guy for you to interact with. His name is Dr. Peter Saffer, and he's the head of the critical care medicine department of this hospital, as well as the anesthesiology department. So at that particular time, Dr. Saffer, who was an innovator, he wanted to prove to the world that it's not how fast you got that person to the emergency room that determine whether they could live or die, but what was being done for them before they got there. But no one would believe him. He had all kinds of trouble getting his vision out to the world. And up comes this organization with this idea of providing medical care to an underserved neighborhood. And he took advantage of that opportunity. He said, okay, I will be willing to teach you if you bring me the people. And he said, and they told him, they said, okay, we'll get the guys for you, but one criteria we have to have. Every last one of them in that class has to be black. And he agreed to that. So he took 25 black men, placed them into a training program, which was one of the most sophisticated training programs that had ever been done anywhere in the world. They spent time in the intensive care unit, in the emergency room, in the operating room, even in the county morgue, studying anatomy and physiology. And once they got all this training together, they were placed out onto the streets. And in doing that, the vehicles that were being used in that time were basically station wagons, for lack of a better term.
Okay.
So there was not enough room in them for these highly trained, skilled guys to provide the care they needed. So they had to redesign that vehicle. They raised the roof of it. They put the seat, which was off to the side of the person that you were transporting, they moved that seat to the head of the patient.
Okay.
So I could see that patient. If he stopped breathing, I could breathe for him. I could take their blood pressure. I can give them oxygen. Anything I could do, I can see that patient. So they changed the vehicles to meet their demands, and then they put them out onto the street to provide the most sophisticated medical care anywhere in this country. Not in the hospital, but outside of the hospital, in a person's home or wherever they
Because
work.
that was the main goal, to get them the care that they needed before they even get to the hospital.
So the goal was to bring the emergency room to the person, instead of rushing the person to the emergency room. So these gentlemen went out on the streets and they started providing the most sophisticated care anywhere in this country. No one in this country was doing what they were doing. And as a result of that, they had two little, I will call them minor problems. They had to teach the community that when I come to your house, I'm essentially bringing the emergency room to you, because the community was used to you coming, picking me up, and rushing me off to the emergency room. So they had to train the community on what to expect. In addition to that, they also had to teach the emergency rooms that when Freedom House brings you a patient, you better expect them to have perhaps an IV. I'm giving you a blood pressure. I'm telling you what the heart rate looks like. I've been giving them this type of medication. So get prepared for this sophisticated medical treatment, and they call it pre-hospital treatment from this ambulance service. So they got it going, and during the first year of operation, they handled roughly about 2,000 calls.
Dang.
Yeah. There was no 911 system at that time. Everybody else in the city of Pittsburgh, besides the Hill District, had to utilize the police. Yeah. And I'll get to it a little bit later to let you know how that came about and what problems it created. Fortunately, during that time, racial tension was high. Racism itself was high. You had communities that suffered from a lack of even the basic care. Housing was a problem in the black communities. Jobs were a problem. And those are the types of things that plagued that community during the early 60s. So there was a lot of riots going on. It was shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. So you look at the communities across this country, and the predominantly black communities were the ones that were getting the short end of the stick. From housing to jobs to job training to even basic things as food and things like that. So you have to kind of try to come up with ideas to offset that. And the federal government at that time looked at all these cities across this country and said, wow, we're going to have to do something. So they start funneling money into these underserved neighborhoods across this country. And the money went toward job training and job placements and things like that, with the idea of trying to change the picture that was being painted by black neighborhoods. So they funneled all this money into them, and each state had a certain amount for their underserved communities, and it was up to them to manage that money in the way that they saw necessary. And fortunately for me and the residents of the city of Pittsburgh, Freedom House Ambulance Service benefited from that initially. Involvement with Freedom House came at a very unusual type situation. I was working in a hospital at the time as a hospital orderly. They now call them nursing assistants. Hospital orderlies, they bathed the male patients. They lifted patients that the nurse aides couldn't lift. They took them back and forth to therapy or to different specialties in the hospital. Orderly was the muscle of the hospital at that time. And I happened to be in a patient's room when two Freedom House paramedics came in to transport a patient home that was being discharged. And I looked at these two guys, and they were two black guys, and they had afros and beards, and that was the style back then. And I had
Right.
one too. And so when they entered that room, they commanded the attention of that room. They didn't have to say anything; just their mere presence commanded the attention of everybody. They didn't demand it; they commanded it, and they really didn't have to say anything. So I kept watching them, and I noticed there was a patch on their uniform, which was a white smock, and it was nice pressed and uh, creased and everything. And they was preparing the patient to transport him home, and they had a portable radio that was saying something that I have no idea what it was. And so they left there. And I said, wow, that's something I want to do.
Right.
So I, in turn, and this may be very difficult for you to envision, I went to the telephone book, which was the Yellow Pages.
Okay.
It was a thick telephone book that had everybody's phone number in it and your address by the name. So if you wanted to locate somebody, all you had to do was go to the Yellow Pages and find them. So I went to the Yellow Pages and found out where Freedom House's ambulances were located, which was at the Presbyterian Hospital on the 10th floor. So in my mind, hey, I'm a hospital orderly. I've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years. I changed bedpans. I bathe patients. I move them back and forth. How difficult could this job be? So I walked up there during my lunch break and walked into the office and said, I'm here to apply for a job. And the guy says, okay, well, that's great. He says, if I showed you a picture of the heart, would you be able to diagram the circulatory system? No.
Yeah.
Okay. If I showed you a picture of the lungs, would you be able to diagram the respiratory system? No. He said, okay, you're not qualified to work here. So I left there, and what happened is, in the perfect world, you would take that as, okay, they said I'm not qualified, so I'll go on back to being an orderly, and
Right.
that's all I could ever be. But what he did when he told me I wasn't qualified is he unleashed a set of what I would call motivators, which were internal, that I didn't know I had. So when he told me I wasn't, I was determined to show him that I was. So I left there and went back to the Yellow Pages and found out where they were. There was a basic, what they call emergency medical technician class at a fire academy, and I called them and enrolled in the class, and the class was 13 weeks long, and I went there and took the course and passed the written exam and got my certificate. And 3 months later, I went back to Freedom House and got hired on the spot.
Okay. That is tough.
And it was such a overwhelming point that white uniform that caught my eye on the day they walked in, they sent me from their offices directly to the uniform store the same day to pick up that white uniform.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
So, as they say, the rest is history.
Right.
So, you know, what happened is I still had a choice to make because I was still working at the hospital. And so I worked 2 jobs for 2 years, 16 hours a day, 7 to 3, and 4 to 12 at Freedom House. And then eventually I had discovered that working at Freedom House was my calling. So I resigned at the hospital and worked for Freedom House the next 3 or 4 years. I want you to know is that Freedom House itself, we all were victims of our own success. Now, the one thing that I try to tell people is that we at Freedom House was considered by society as the least likely to succeed. We were unemployable. We were society's throwaways. And as I think about that, I often tell people that society made one mistake. They didn't tell us. So we were living in the moment, creating, better yet, serving an underserved community or somewhat neglected community with the best pre-hospital care that anyone in the country was ever getting. What we later found out in doing this is that your affluent neighborhoods, which were predominantly white, got wind of what was going on in the Hill District. So they, in turn, voiced their concerns to the political powers, obviously the mayor.
Right.
How dare you allow those poor welfare recipients over there in the Hill District have better medical care than I do?
Mm.
I voted for you.
Who was the mayor at the time?
Peter Flaherty.
Oh, he was in the that's funny because we visited the mayor's office and he was right there with the portrait. Okay, continue.
Yeah. I contributed to your campaign. I voted for you. I own this business or this $1 million home. You better do something about this. So the mayor, Pete Flaherty, had to bow to the wishes of his constituents. And when he did that, there was no room in his plan for an entity such as Freedom House. So instead of him expanding Freedom House, he created his own EMS system. And Freedom House was not part of it. And when he did that, he just couldn't say, okay, y'all are done.
Right.
So he had to come up with a strategic way to get rid of this organization. And what he did is he instituted a set of policies. An example would be, or the example would be, okay, Freedom House, you're not allowed to use your lights and sirens to go on calls, which impacted your response time.
Right.
So you call me for a heart attack, I can go to start out and I'll stop at the red light, wait for it to change, and go to the next one, in the meantime, you're laying down in the middle of the street, unconscious and not breathing, and your heart's not beating.
And people ain't gonna move because there ain't no signs.
Right. There's no reason for them. Right. That's one. And that's one hurdle. The second one is that Freedom House had a contract with the city of Pittsburgh to provide emergency care to the business district downtown. So every year, say for example, Freedom House would get a check from the city of Pittsburgh for $50,000, $60,000. That was a lot of money back then. So what happened is he decided, okay, well maybe I'm not going to give you this 50 or 60,000. I'll give you 5. 2 months later, I'll give you 10.
Yeah.
Another couple of months later, another 5. So all the while he was throwing these hurdles and barriers at the ambulance service, which made it very difficult for us to survive in a political environment.
Right.
And don't forget, racism played a major role in this whole entity. So as a result of that, the mayor behind the scenes was creating his own EMS system. And the way he did it is he brought in an all-white service from the suburbs. People that had no empathy or compassion for being in an inner city environment.
Right.
So they came in with preconceived ideas. Living in the city or working in the city is the most dangerous place in the world. So in order to work here, I have to be prepared. So I come in, I'll have a knife in my boots or a gun in my car. And because you never know, the trucks themselves had what they call 7-cell flashlights, a flashlight with 7 batteries which was approximately about 24 inches long, not to find your way around in the dark, but to use as a weapon because I'm in this urban environment. I'm going to get attacked, so I have to have something. The trucks themselves had handcuffs on them.
Wow.
In addition to that, the personnel were dressed the same as police.
Yeah.
So the individuals that worked there had a preconceived idea of what it would be like, number one, and also, since I'm dressed like law enforcement, I'm going to take on the authority of law enforcement. So I can come in your house and you're sick and your loved one can start telling me what's wrong, and I can look, shut up.
Right.
I got it. It was not uncommon for an EMS unit to put its lights and sirens on and pull over a car that went through a stop sign. They didn't have the authority to do it.
Right. It's not even their role.
Right. That was the type of mentality they had. To compound that stereotype, the department stereotyped specific neighborhoods throughout the city. Your public housing complexes, your rundown neighborhoods, which during that time were predominantly black. The paramedics were taught, they were trained to believe that in a public housing complex, the projects, you're not going to get a heart attack or a stroke or diabetic. Those people don't have those kind of injuries. The only thing you're going to get is a shooting, a drug overdose, domestic violence. That's all they do. So if I'm going into a public housing complex and I'm already programmed that it's a dangerous area, I'm going to ask the police to meet me there, whether I need them or not.
Right.
So you combine that with the department created a policy that the paramedics determined, and they called it a no medical emergency. They determined whether they wanted to take you to the hospital or not.
You see where all that chaos.
Yeah. So if I can come to your house and I can examine you and say, okay, well, you don't look sick to me. Why don't you get an Uber or something, a family member to come and get you and take you to the hospital? You're not sick enough to ride in my truck. And then I'll leave.
Yeah, that's...
So you got that. And what happened is Freedom House itself, before we were so absorbed by the city of Pittsburgh, we entered into an agreement with them. And the agreement said, I will take all of Freedom House's personnel. I will take your equipment. You will not have to go through any additional training. Everything will be smoothly, but they reneged on the contract, the agreement. The agreement said I had to take you, but it didn't say I had to keep you.
So it pretty much was a screw over.
Right. Yeah. So the City of Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services at that time, back in 1975, instituted a systematic way of eliminating as many of Freedom House's employees as they could, and it was very, very successful. 75 to 80% of the people that worked for Freedom House were terminated.
Dang.
So if you think about it, people oftentimes say they've never heard of Freedom House. And even though that saddens me, I understand the reason why. Because if you get rid of the people that made history, you essentially get rid of that part of history that they made. And that was the intent of Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services at that time. So imagining, me, I went there, I wasn't allowed to do anything. I couldn't drive the truck, I couldn't examine a patient, I couldn't talk on the radio. I was a third person, I was just an observer. Until one day we walked into a person's home and the person was lying there on the couch, and the crew I was working with, we walked in and the person was unconscious. They were not breathing and their heart was not beating. And the crew didn't know what to do. So they looked at the person that wasn't allowed to do anything and said, "You take over."
Mm-hmm.
So I assigned duties and responsibilities, and we subsequently saved the person's life. And that's great. But it had to be kept quiet because I wasn't allowed to do anything. So at that particular time, I had to make a decision. Was I going to remain the passive, docile person that they wanted me to be? Were trying to frustrate me to the point where I would say, okay, I don't want to work here anymore? Or was I going to step up my game and let them know who John Moon was? And I chose the latter. I chose to be more outspoken, more demanding, and I wanted Pittsburgh EMS to know who John Moon was. So at the scenes of calls, I would take a more aggressive approach at treating the patient. Because if you look at the big picture, I'm the only one on that truck that knew what to do. So for me to stand back and allow you to do something that perhaps wasn't the right thing is jeopardizing the patient's life or their safety. So I decided to step up my game. I became more vocal and more determined. I wanted you to know who I was. And it subsequently was very successful. It was based on the same premise that Freedom House used back in 1967.
The Freedom House EMT, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Go out into the community, recruit people in the community, put them into a training class, pay them to go to school, and once they completed it, guarantee them a job.
Mm.
That's what Pittsburgh EMS has done because she has a black chief.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. It went full circle from you,
Mm-hmm.
everyone getting kicked out and all that in
Mm-hmm.
1975, and then a black chief that we have today, 50 years anniversary.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because when I worked there, I noticed that the department was steadily becoming whiter and whiter and whiter. We went 10 years without hiring an African American.
And took it back.
Yeah. So I voiced my concerns about the department's hiring process.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did is, once I said, look, this is wrong, you can't continue to do this. Okay, well, you came up with the idea, you figure out how to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. So I designed the very first, what they call diversity recruitment program from the ground up. And I used it just like Freedom House did. I went out into the community and recruited people that had no idea what a paramedic was or an EMT, put them into a training program, paid them to go to school, and once they completed it, got the city to hire them because they had invested all this money into these people. And that program, I started that in 1990, and it lasted up until roughly, I would say, about 2000. That became the normal way of hiring anybody up until the time I left. And then they went back to the normal way of doing things. So now the diversity numbers are dismal. There's about 6 paramedics out of a workforce of 200. Weeks ago, when he was honoring the Freedom House people, of course, he honored the legendary John Moon first. And he said, I'm here to right the wrong that was done 50 years ago. And he wrote it in a proclamation. So anybody that looks at my proclamation from the city of Pittsburgh, from the mayor, will see that on this particular day, the city acknowledged that they did wrong to Freedom House Ambulance Service, and we're here to make it right. That's it, written in the proclamation.